Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. My name is Amal, and I am a professor in Arabic Studies and Comparative Literature Department here at Williams College. My teaching and research is on Indigenous Studies, Global South Studies, world literatures, border theory, creative writing, and feminisms in the plural sense. And this semester, I'm teaching a course on Arab women memoirs and memoir writing. And I'm very, very delighted to be here with you here this evening for this special talk with author alum Stacy Schiff on her book, Cleopatra, A Life. It's organized as a part of the Purple Prose Book Club and the Bicentennial of Society of Alumni. This program is one of a year-long series of events commemorating the 200 years anniversary of the founding of the Williams College Society of Alumni. Our society is the oldest alumni association in North America and quite possibly the world. We're spending this bicentennial year not only celebrating and grappling with our past, but also examining our present and imagining our future. Together, we envision an inclusive society where all alumni feel they belong. We are united in our shared commitment to a liberal art education, to lifelong learning, and most especially to teach each other and to our college. As we begin the program, we acknowledge a legacy of an ongoing displacement of Indigenous Mohican people from the lands upon which Williams College is built. Williams College resides on the ancestral and spiritual lands of the Mohican people. Each of us comes to this virtual space from all over the country on the traditional land of Indigenous people. We pay respect to our Indigenous elders, past and present, by acknowledging our troubled history and its ongoing impact on our contemporary moment. Thank you for being here with us. And want to mention a few reminders before we start. First, if you have any questions, please, during our talk, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen at any time. It's open there and we have tech support to read it. We also have dedicated time for Q&A toward the end of the program, but you can submit your questions as you think of them. Second, please reserve the chat as a space to engage with the community and to share any reflections or comments you may have. Remember to select everyone in the chat drop down so that your message can be seen by all. And third, please note that we will be recording today's session. And with that, I want to introduce our featured speaker, Stacy Schiff, Williams class of 1982, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and a Williams College Bicentennial medalist. Ahlan wa sahlan, Stacy, as we say in Arabic, welcome. So Stacy is the author, most recently, of The Witches, Salem, 1692, which the New York Times hailed as, and I quote, an almost novelistic, thriller-like narrative, end quote. Her previous work, which we will be discussing tonight, Cleopatra, A Life, was published to great acclaim in 2010. As the Wall Street Journal's review put it, quote, Schiff does a rare thing. She gives us a book we have missed if it didn't exist, end quote. Cleopatra appeared on most year-end-based book lists, including the New York Times Top 10 Book of 2010, and won the Penn Jacqueline Bograd Weld Award for biography. Also a #1 bestseller, Cleopatra was translated into 30 languages. Stacy, as well is the author of Vera, Mr. Vladimir Nabokov, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, Saint-Exupéry, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and A Great Improvisation, Franklin, France, and the Birth of America, winner of the George Washington Book Prize, the Ambassador Award in American Studies, and the Gilbert Chynard Prize of the Institut Français d'Amérique. All three were New York Times notable books. Among many honors and awards, Stacy has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and was a Director's Fellow at the Kuhlman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. We are so pleased to have Stacy here with us. And Stacy, let's dive right into our conversations, and welcome again. Ahlan wa sahlan.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
So I'm thinking of our engagement today with you and the book. It's just a series of questions about your writing, the book itself. But I want to share with the audience my bias, the bias behind my own question, because I'm teaching this semester, as I mentioned, a course on Arab women memoirs, and we're writing memoirs by Arab women writers as feminist text and feminist text to history. So what a great honor to be here today with somebody who wrote a biography of a feminist icon like Cleopatra. So my first question to you, Stacy, is, I know you're from the Purple Valley from Adams, and it seems like it's a long way, both geographically and temporally, from the Purple Valley to Hellenistic Egypt. So maybe if you just reflect and share with us what inspired you to embark on this journey, and to kind of excavate it, doing the archaeological work of digging into the life of Cleopatra, and also from a gender perspective and a geopolitical point of view. That time of Cleopatra seems also culturally far. Far from. So how was kind of this journey for you?
Let me start with the temporal and cultural, because we were just talking about the oldest alumni association, and part of the problem when you start thinking about the ancient world is remembering what the word ancient meant, because the distances are so much greater than the distances to which we're accustomed. So, for example, Cleopatra and Nefertiti, with whom she is often confused, are 1,300 years apart. For Cleopatra, there had already been thousands of years of history. There was already graffiti on the pyramids. I mean, just the distances are so much more impressive and so much harder for us to get our minds around, really. I think the short answer to your question is it was Ben Franklin's fault. My previous book was a book about Ben Franklin's 8.5 years in France during the American Revolution. For those 8.5 years, there are miles of documentation. I mean, biographers like to brag in sort of cubic feet, and this was just the most ridiculous mountain of documentation imaginable, in which it was 2.5 times the documentation for the entire rest of Franklin's life combined. And you can read through all of that, as I dutifully did, and then realize that there are certain questions that remain unanswered. And so in a funny way, I think, having thought about Cleopatra before the Franklin book, after the Franklin book, I was prepared to say, well, you can have all the documentation in the world and still not be able to answer a legitimate question. And I think I was a little bit more comfortable with simply saying we don't know, or with the fungibility of history and the elasticity of history to some extent. I knew I wasn't necessarily going to come up with answers, and I knew I could say we don't know on the page. So I'm going to blame it to some extent on Ben Franklin, and I'm also going to blame a fellow Williams graduate, because this was not originally my idea. It was the idea of another member of the class of 1982 who had come up with the idea, because I had been writing a lot about women in power for a series of newspaper columns. And I kept tripping. This must have been about 5 years before the book is published. It's about 2005. At that very dangerous intersection of women in power. Why did so many of us have an allergy to Hillary Clinton? What was it about women's voices that, when raised, become shrill? Why is strategy in men looked upon as manipulation in women? I mean, all of these questions for which I had no answers. And this lovely person said, you maybe should think about Cleopatra, to which I said, speaking to your point about feminist memoir, I'll write that book as soon as we find the diaries. Anyway, I ended up writing the book anyway, and it was Marc de la Brière's idea, my husband.
Okay. This is, fascinating, just like from Franklin to Cleopatra. It's such a...
Yes, right? I mean,
yeah. So you mentioned something here about the kind of the model of Hillary Clinton, and just like maybe, and in some ways of, this is the US, and still there is no women in power in the same way that other countries have been, or other empires that had, including, let's say, Benazir Bhutto or Queen of Sheba. So there was, why is something in particular about Cleopatra that got your attention in comparison to other like iconic women in power? Because it seems like, it's a lot of digging to do in terms of archive, but also in terms of time, and it's, did we need to go that far in the past to find, to that ancient world to reclaim a woman figure like Cleopatra? So I'm trying to understand the historical arc between Cleopatra and Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, there isn't an obvious, they're not obvious, but, best friends there. She, in the sense that she is the mythical woman, and the woman to whom so much sexual innuendo and, imagery is attached, she became this sort of obsession on my part. What's interesting about Cleopatra, of course, which is less the case with other women whom you've just named, she doesn't exist unless there's a Roman in the room. We have no words of her own, none. At the very most, we might have 3, and we're not even certain that those are hers. They're very likely a scribe who was working for her. So her history falls completely to male hands. And I don't think there's another woman, maybe an English queen at some juncture. There aren't a lot of other women for whom we have no voice whatsoever. And I think that seemed, at the time, it seemed like a good idea. For the next 5 years, I suffered greatly for that reason. But I think that was one of the things that enchanted, as was this kind of retrospective sexual fitting. A lot of women in history and in the Bible develop sexual histories after the fact. I mean, Cleopatra is a woman who is known as the Great Seductress. She seduces the two of the most famous Romans of her time. If you look at the record, those 2 famous Romans have voracious sexual appetites. They're grand seducers. One of them seduces the queen of Mauritania after he leaves Cleopatra. The other one seduces the queen of Cappadocia on his way to meet Cleopatra, but she's the one who comes down to us as the great seductress. So I think sort of beginning to unravel some of those questions of how we transmuted her power and her intelligence into this sexual history was really compelling to me.
Thank you, and that's really just a nice segue to my next question, which also talks about the erasure of her history as a woman in power. In chapter 1, we titled "The Egyptian Women." I personally was captivated by this sentence, and I quote: "The siren call of the East long predated Cleopatra, but no matter. She hailed from the intoxicating land of sex and excess. It is not difficult to understand why Caesar became history and Cleopatra a legend." End quote. And here I feel like, how did you address this double paradigm of, on the one hand, you have an Orientalist representation of the East that's always associated with, hypersexuality, fantasy, Western fantasy of harem, but also of, seductive women and hypersexualized. And then also this gendered notion of history, because what made Cleopatra a legend, whereas, Caesar, became, history. And what strategies did you rely on as a writer to narrate the story of Cleopatra beyond the exotic image of sex and excess and excess? And how was the process of making that Egyptian women become history?
The process was just deadly. I would not recommend it to anyone. That's a great question, Amal. When you dive into the ancients to any great extent, you begin to realize that the stories get recycled a great deal. And one of the interesting things when you look at Cleopatra is that so many of the tales about ostentatious, opulent, immense, extravagantly wealthy Eastern sovereigns had already been told, and they simply got recycled for Cleopatra. I mean, to start with, the story of the pearl dissolving in wine. That's actually not a Cleopatra story. That had existed long before her. The obsession with, this is just particularly pertinent, so I must mention it, the obsession with purple and gold, which were the colors that were associated with ostentatious, with great luxury, were the colors that were attributed to every Eastern sovereign. He ate too much roasted peacock, and he doused himself in unguents, and he dissolved pearls in wine, and he dressed himself in purple and gold. So all of this sort of, the excessive sexual East, all of these stories wrapped themselves around Cleopatra. And it's interesting to see how they get just pulled out of the woodwork and reutilized in her case. I think the short answer to your question on this one is I realized early on that you have to keep in mind who your sources are. I had to know which sources I could actually credit and which sources I needed to keep an eye on, which sources I needed to reject completely. All of these men are writing, obviously, for different reasons. Each of them has a different agenda. Many of the agendas are the same, which is that they're writing to satisfy a Roman ruler of one kind or another. Some of them are writing in verse. Some of them are writing much, much later. So keeping in mind the temporal distance from Cleopatra, who had ever set eyes on Egypt, who had a particular political stake in this contest, who had other reasons to be pleasing someone who was sitting in Rome, who wanted to hear the most evil things he could possibly hear about Cleopatra. That said, our best sources are still quite distant from Cleopatra. And it was important to me to be able to inject a little bit of, distance, I guess, or felt in some way between the story as it's come down to, what we can say and what we really can't say, or what we can't really say with any sort of certitude. So, for example, Plutarch is writing 100 years after Cleopatra's death. That's a long time. And, on the subject of Plutarch, who is probably our best source, at least Cleopatra herself, there's a marvelous moment in the last years of Cleopatra's life when she and Mark Antony are having a great party in Alexandria, and a young royal cook invites a friend in to see the kitchen. And the kitchen at this point is in a state of utter uproar. People are shouting and people are screaming, and there are zillions of boar roasting on spits. And the young medical student, says to the cook, "Oh, I see you're going to have a huge party tonight." And the cook says, "No, really just 12 people, but here's how it works." And he explains that Mark Antony might want to have dinner at any hour. And so they have to be ready. The boars have to be ready on different levels of readiness at different points in the evening, so as to accommodate Mark Antony's rather fickle schedule. Anyway, that story, which is told in some detail, was told by that medical student to his grandson, handed down 2 generations, and the grandson happens to be Plutarch. So we're talking about stories that are very, the oral tradition, fortunately for us, is stronger in those days, but you're talking about stories that are several times removed from the truth. There were no tape recorders in the 19th century, but we're talking about a much more quicksand when it comes to our facts. So I felt that the only way to do it, the original idea had been, well, maybe this was just kind of 5 scenes from the life of Cleopatra, because that's really all we can possibly do to give the life a shape. And then I began to realize that there was enough material in unusual places that you actually could write a fairly linear account, darting around certain corners which remain obscure, but where you had to really be able to stress the fact that the sources are in many ways faulty, and in many ways non-existent, and in many ways tendentious. And then in the case of her death, which we can talk about later if you like, there are 2 completely contradictory accounts.
Yeah. We will talk about her death later. We're so interested in her life.
After all, yeah.
So my next question kind of also in the same vein of writing a history of prominent women figures, and I think just also the difference between when we think of them as legends and icons and versus actually going and telling their story as history. And your thick description of Cleopatra's polyphony and her astute skills as an orator are really vivid and rich. You really capture how magnificent she was, and and whether it's through your detailed account of her pioneering command of Greek or her mastery of the language of commerce and trade in Rome. So she would, here we have an example of like the most, powerful, but also the most rich women in Rome. And you show us Cleopatra as cosmopolitan, charismatic, intellectual. And then you also point out that she was, and I'm quoting, not merely economically independent, but richer than any man in Rome. So it shows that, her exceptionality. And your reader, as a reader, I feel like, you can't help but be impressed by the unique status and the historical singularity of Cleopatra. And on the one hand, it seemed like, was she an anomaly? I'm blanking on the word in English, like, something like an exceptional, and then like, where are the other women? Like, was she, kind of like, that's always kind of, to be a powerful woman, then like, you're the only woman in the boys club. So you're just surrounded by all these emperors. And then, you're through your careful analysis and writing, also thoughtful writing, you show us kind of that she was resented by men in her time. Like, and then you quote an example from Cicero, who did not, hide his hate, and you quote him, and he said, "I detest the queen." And then you have this line and said, "History belongs to the eloquent." So for me, this was, showing that, in a way, that was your critique of Cicero, and a revelation of your feminist sensibilities as a biographer. And then how does it, were there other moments in the book where you felt you kind of like, the feminist in you, the feminist biographer in you, had to kind of, you're rebuking Cicero here? Were there any nonfiction elements that you used in your craft, in your writing, and your historiographical approach to not just, give just to her, but also to show the level of the misogyny that she encountered?
You make a good point. The context, and I should have talked about this, the context is so crucial here. Okay. Because she's not an anomaly in the East. There had been any number of female rulers in the East. There had been any number of Ptolemaic queens before her in Egypt. She's an anomaly for Rome. And this is the moment, of course, where Rome has begun its rise to power. And that's, by the way, something that I think always takes us aback, is the fact that Egypt at this point is still the great power, and Rome is the sort of provincial muddy backwater. Rome is not the place you went if you wanted a good library. Alexandria was the place you went if you wanted a doctor or an animal trainer or a craftsperson of any kind. Rome is really still in the Dark Ages, but militarily it's begun to come into its own. So she's not an anomaly, except insofar as she now has come into contact with the West. And to their minds, as you point out, she is an execration. I mean, they can't deal with the fact that she's a woman in power, much less the fact, and it took me a long time to realize this, she's the richest person in the Mediterranean world, hands down. Everything that is in Egypt belongs to her. Every item in Egypt that is tilled, sold, grown, whatever, is taxed, and all of that tax goes to her. She's indescribably rich. And that alone, by Roman standards, puts her in a realm of, she's objectionable by their standards, obviously. Add to that so many other layers here, and it adds up to something that's really quite toxic. To your question about Cicero, I mean, the problem with Cicero for me is that Cicero is so immensely quotable and so much easier. Unlike Cleopatra, we have his voice. We have so much that he wrote. He's immensely prolific, even though we've lost a great deal of him. He kept somewhat taking over the narrative. And I kept finding myself having to prune away because his voice dominated her so often. I mean, it's very hard for us to find her voice, although we have it from Plutarch a bit. And Cicero always gets carried away with the story. But that speaks in a funny way to some of what the problem is that we know so much about her. We know almost everything we know about her stay in Rome, which is during the time that Caesar is assassinated, from Cicero. And this speaks to your question about sources. Cicero is always a somewhat petulant character. He always reacts poorly to insolence. He likes to be the smartest person in the room. He has a very vexed relationship with women. At the point where Cleopatra arrives, he has divorced a wife whom he thought was not quite as domestically attentive as she should have been and too interested in the political scene. He has lost a very beloved, very well-educated daughter who was approximately Cleopatra's age. He likes to pride himself on his library. So an intelligent woman with a better library than he has is really going to irritate him. Mm-hmm. And something happens of which we have only somewhat obscure clues, where he asks to borrow a book, and something goes awry, some communication goes awry between the two of them, and somehow the book exchange is never completed. And either for that reason, or because he's overly charmed by Cleopatra on one account and he's embarrassed by the fact that he's so taken in by her, or for some other reason that does not come down to us, he just despises her. He also, I should add, had hated her father, doesn't like Caesar, considers himself a born and bred Republican. There are very many reasons to hate an Egyptian dynast at this point. Mm-hmm. But his vitriol outlives Cleopatra, of course. And, on the one hand, he gives us these few clues that we have as to her existence in Rome during the last moments of Caesar's life. On the other hand, it's an extremely biased view. So, blessedly we have Cicero, but unblessedly we have Cicero. To your question about feminism, I'm happy it reads as a feminist book. I hope it reads as a feminist book. I didn't intend for it to read as a feminist book. Several years ago, I was told that it's being taught in a course at Yale as a feminist tract in disguise. And I thought, that's okay with me. Wasn't what I intended, but I'll that. So I think in the sense that, if recovering a woman's voice and putting a woman back on fair and level ground when she's been essentially turned into a cartoon for other people's political reasons, if that's a feminist approach, absolutely. I think there wasn't a I don't think the historiography was particularly, I didn't overthink the question of where I was coming from, except to sort of keep the sources in view and in check.
Thank you. And you just mentioned something, if we have time, I'll get back to it later, about the representation of Cleopatra in Rome. But we want to move to the other question. My next question is, in Taboo Memories, Diasporic Voices, Duke Press 2006, cultural theorist Ella Shohat dedicates a special chapter for Cleopatra and her representation in Hollywood and the Western cultural imagination. There's a chapter titled "In Cleopatra Between Eurocentrism and Afrocentrism." Shohat argues that our reading of Cleopatra's history should be within the larger context of ages of antiquity. There is no single antiquity. There are like many antiquities, rather than the age of antiquity, which usually follows a very Eurocentric lens and centers Greek civilization as purely European and white. And then hence, it erases the millennial history of cultural melange between Greek and Egypt and the mixed origins of Cleopatra. I know that recently there has been a lot of conversation about Cleopatra's skin color or racial identity. Did you come any resources, archives, fragments that might tell us more about the identity of Cleopatra, her Africanness, and possibly Blackness? How did you engage with this material in your construction of Cleopatra as an example of Mediterranean centricism?
It's lost to us that she is an entirely bicultural figure, in the sense that there are two very discrete populations in Egypt at the time. There is a sort of aristocratic layer of Greeks who are essentially managing and profiting from a much larger population of Egyptians. And it really is a sort of class distinction. And obviously, the Greek population gravitates more and is more based in Alexandria. And as you go south, you go from a much more Greek-speaking world to a Egyptian-speaking world. Cleopatra, we know from Plutarch, speaks 9 languages. And among those, she is the first of her dynasty, the first of the Ptolemies, to bother to learn Egyptian, the people, the language of the people over whom she rules.
Yeah.
And that would have been a source of immense goodwill. I mean, she's extremely popular, and this is something that she and Caesar have in common. They're both of them much more popular with the men in the street than they are with the aristocrats among them. She's very popular among her people. There's almost no uprising in the course of her reign. There's tremendous loyalty as she heads south. So there's already this sort of bicultural trick going on with her in the sense that there are two codes of law. There are two different populations with two very different with two very different agendas, and who are very often in conflict with each other. So that a lot of, I mean, what she does in the course of the day is astonishing, but a lot of the just general domestic scene is often rife with problems between the two populations. Mm-hmm. So that is just something I think that we lose sight of because we've so much lost sight of the Hellenistic world and certainly Hellenistic Egypt. As far as the Africanness, as you put it, of her goes, it's a somewhat closed case in the sense that for reasons that we don't really understand, the Ptolemies decided to practice sibling marriage. Mm-hmm. So of the, I think it's the 10 generations before Cleopatra, no one had married anything other than a blood relative. And they are all of them Macedonian Greek, which is to say that although it is possible that a Persian princess stuck in there somewhere, mm-hmm. She descends from an entirely Greek background. We know very little about her skin color or her hair color. It's more likely that she was honey skinned than that she was dark skinned. Certainly somebody somewhere would probably have mentioned it otherwise, not reasoning from a silence here, but her parents are full siblings, which means she had one set of grandparents. I mean, the family tree is just astonishing to look at because of all of these extremely close connections. But she has, it's a very, very tight group of relatives. It's also a murderous group of relatives, as we know. But because of that, there really is very little chance that she has any Egyptian blood, any African blood whatsoever. I think that the confusion comes in the fact that she was a queen of each. She is an African queen. She is a queen based in Africa. So it's very hard, I think, to disentangle those concepts.
Yeah. So because I know also like recently in terms of understanding of racial identity, like, can we think of Cleopatra as a Black woman? Although like her skin's color is white,
So if her skin color is white, are we thinking of her as a Black woman in a cultural sense?
In the cultural sense, but also could be also racially, because, we know that there was a lot of mixing at the time, more of racial mixing. Except that
there could hardly have been racial mixing in a family that only married siblings, right?
Okay.
I mean, it's one of the few families where I would say, just based on how these people had decided, it was a very calculated decision to not let any insiders in. I mean, partly this is the family firm, which would have been true of any royal family, but partly there was this seeming association with the gods and the goddesses. This is some speculation as to why the Ptolemies decided to do this, but the feeling was, if it was good enough for Zeus and Hera, it's good enough for us. I mean, that there was this sense that they're keeping things very close, they're keeping away pesky in-laws, they're not in any way distributing power among a larger group of people, and the sort of ancillary result of this was that it made the women in the family much more important because, of course, they were the only prospects when you needed to get married. So it made a Ptolemaic princess worth a great deal more than she would have been had the pool for potential mates been larger. So in a funny way, it increases women's power as well.
Thanks. Okay, I just want to be mindful of time. We're about 8:40, so and I have two more questions, and I know we have a question in the audience, so maybe I'll just ask one question and then we'll open the floor for a question from the audience. Your portrayal of Cleopatra's motherhood is also fascinating, because on the one hand we have how she was perceived as the seducer, the kind of femme fatale, but you point out that her motherhood gave her more power, it solidified her power, and she was able to get links with the native priest, and she had more authority. Her authority was not contradicted by her motherhood. On the contrary, it was, solidified. But she was, at the same time, she was still the queen Cleopatra, the goddess, the younger, father-loving and fatherland-loving. So here, going back to maybe my question is more from a modern context, when we think about mothers of the nation and mothers of modern nation, and it was really during the Egyptian uprising in 2011, like when Egyptian feminists and also graffiti artists reclaimed their ancient past, and especially like images of Nefertiti, Cleopatra. So it wasn't just reclaiming that pharaonic past or the legacy of to affirm kind of the that Egypt is a strong independent country with an exceptional past, with many strong women, but also to reclaim the political agency and power of women as decision making. So there's the reclaiming of Cleopatra in the Egyptian context of the revolution was very, very clear, and very. So how do you think, for you in writing about her motherhood, like how did it fit into the larger political scheme and also the image of the matriarch, thinking of Cleopatra as a matriarch?
It feels very counterintuitive, doesn't it? That she could be on the one hand this kind of warrior princess, and on the other hand, she does something which is quite brilliant from a political point of view, and I think ties into what you're saying, which is that very early on, she associates herself more closely than had any other Ptolemaic queen with the goddess Isis. And it's a funny word to pronounce today. Yeah. And Isis is a sort of just combination of all of the great. She's Hera, she's Aphrodite, she's Demeter, all sort of rolled into one. And she has these extraordinary powers. I mean, she's thought to be able to heal wounds. She's responsible for the love that joins parents and children. She set the sun and the moon on their course. She has brought order from chaos. She's the ultimate Earth Mother in many ways. And Cleopatra forges that alliance very closely and uses it politically in a very deft manner, which is helped by the fact that, and we didn't talk about this at all, she has this amazing tendency to get pregnant by the right people at the right time. And she has a son by Caesar very early on. Mm-hmm. And with Caesar's son, she is able to force the imagery even further in terms of the association with Isis. The Isis story very neatly parallels Cleopatra's love affair with Caesar. And she's also able to rule with that son as her co-regent, because even though she's all powerful as a woman, she does need a male escort of some kind. And she's able to substitute in this infant child of hers for one of her pesky brothers who would have normally been the consort. Mm-hmm. So it's a sort of double play. It's a very smart play on her part to have comported herself like Isis, to dress like Isis, to have iconographically, she's very brilliant in terms of forcing that alliance. So yes, and I'm trying to think if there's another, like Marianne for France, if there's another symbol of a woman in that respect, who is as all-embracing and sort of on the one and generous-minded, and sort of it's not a fertility goddess, but it's a goddess who's so deeply powerful that she sets the Roman teeth on edge. Isis temples were very long forbidden in Rome for this reason. It was really female power in its greatest essence. And what we didn't talk about, and I don't want to take up time from questions, but there is this enormous agency for women in Egypt at the time. Mm-hmm. And that may have flowed from the very fact that Isis was revered, and most households had a little Isis statue somewhere. Isis really is one of the ruling deities. And it's because of that, to some extent, it is thought that Egyptian women had the rights they had at the time, which were, we can talk about them later if you like, but which women don't regain again for 2,000 years. So it's a very advanced civilization in the matriarchal sense.
Thank you, Stacy. I could see us, going on in these, two questions more, and I feel like I wanted to get more into the question on the racial aspect of her identity, but somebody from in the audience is asking that. So if you're okay, we're gonna turn now to the questions. We have two questions. So Mac is asking, how do you think Cleopatra and Ben Franklin, your previous subjects, would getting along at your dinner, your party, like in the New York Times query? And Mark enjoyed both books. So that's, one question, and then we'll go to the next question.
How do I think Cleopatra? It's a really, Ben Franklin, I don't want to take anything away from Cleopatra. Ben Franklin was a remarkably charming and very terse man. We think of him as as a man of many words, but in fact, he's relatively, he's the kind of dinner guest who sits back for a long time and then sort of a perfect epigram just sort of jumps out of his mouth. Cleopatra, as we know from Plutarch, is charm incarnate. I mean, it's almost impossible, as he tells us, to be in her presence and not be captivated by her. He says she knows every possible kind. She knows flattery in every language. She's utterly bewitching. It's the contact of her presence, not her looks, that make her so extraordinarily compelling. So, you think that these two charmers, one of them a little bit more outgoing and one of them a little bit more recessive, would probably have, have quite taken to each other. But that, I will admit, that is a thought I've never entertained before.
Thank you. And then the next question is from Anonymous. I'm hoping to clarify the question about racial identity, given that definitions of race have historically been both fluid and manipulated. Would past conceptions of race define Cleopatra's race differently than we would do today? And if I may, wanted to add to that, question, because you mentioned that she was from the royal elite, so there is possibly a sibling marriage, so possibly there was no racial mixing. But if we think of generations before that, because in a more kind of like a pre-antiquity, could possibly there have been kind of like racial mixing that also makes Cleopatra partially Black, and although visibly she's not Black. Especially in the context of Africa and the Mediterranean at the time.
Here we're on totally speculative terrain.
Okay.
We know what we know about her looks, purely based. I mean, we have descriptions in Plutarch, and no one basically says she's a beauty. Everyone says it was the contact of her presence that was so bewitching. We know what we know of her looks from her coin portraits, and in the coin portraits, in which she looks very much like her father, she clearly has what we would today consider to be classic Semitic looks. She's got a very strong chin. She has a Semitic nose, very hooked nose, very, very high cheekbones. She doesn't necessarily look like a raving beauty, although if you were to be a queen who issued coins, you probably wanted to look more authoritative than you wanted to look like a beauty. But there isn't a clue there really as to her racial identity. So the only thing that leaves us to go on, since those are really the only portraits we can really take at face value, is what we know about how the Ptolemies conducted themselves, as a dynasty. Mm-hmm. And as I said, that's really all we have in terms of the intermarriage for those previous 10 generations. Mm-hmm. I mean, there is this concocted, and we didn't talk about this, there is this concocted genealogy with Alexander the Great, because the Ptolemaic dynasty is founded by one of Alexander the Great's childhood friends and great generals. And it is from that contact with Alexander that the mythology, so to speak, of the dynasty descends. And it's part of the reason why Cleopatra is so immensely compelling to someone like Caesar. Everyone in the ancient world wants to be Alexander the Great. And again, by the way, temporally speaking, we should probably point out that Alexander the Great is farther away from Cleopatra than 1776 is from us today. I mean, this was a long time before, but the image and the legend live on. And to consort with someone like Cleopatra, who had some sort of tenuous link with Alexander the Great, was like consorting with a different kind of royalty altogether. So there's also that. I mean, that too is a Macedonian Greek piece of it. Mm-hmm. Part of what we know about the identity.
Thank you. We don't have any more questions in the Q&A, but I do have a question that I didn't ask before. So it's something that, in writing about Cleopatra, and you have also other biographies about other dangerous women. So you have Mrs. Nabokov, Vera, you have you wrote a book about the witches, Salem. So all these kind of, typical, archetype of dangerous women. How do you compare your experience of writing about them? And that's one question. And then we have also another question in the Q&A from Paul Miller. Do you want to answer my question there first, or take Paul's questions?
You don't think I can keep two questions in my mind at the same time?
Okay.
Because, it occurred to me at one point that there are three ways for women to really make their mark. There's it's like the 3 Ds. It's like death, delusion, and disability. So it's, somebody like Cleopatra, somebody like Helen Keller, or somebody like Joan of Arc. So, and those were the only 3 ways, it seemed to me, that a woman left her mark on the world for a long time. And I think that, part of going back here is taking the history and just sort of reversing it, looking at the other side of the carpet to find where the voices were trapped or got lost or went astray. For the Nabokov book, for example, we know that Vera Nabokov was in the car, for example. Nabokov didn't drive, Vera drove him everywhere. So she's in the car when he's writing his books on his index cards in the car. What was she doing all that time? I mean, just the fact that she's there, but invisible to us, because he only speaks about the fact that he's in the car. Vera Nabokov types everything that her husband writes, and as they both say, occasionally asking questions along the way and adding, suggesting a word here and there. Well, what do we call that? Do we call that editing? Do we call that typing? Do we call that collaboration? I mean, there are many different words for that. And for many years, she was simply considered his typist. And to the point where, when I first started the book, Nabokov's biographer said, you can write this book if you like, but there's no book there. So, there was a real sense on my part that there was some story there, especially given the fact that she was a woman who, unlike Cleopatra, erased herself from the record. I mean, really literally erased herself from the margins of books in which she appeared. And I should just add, with Cleopatra, part of what makes it even more interesting is that the Romans inflate her presence for their own reasons. They need to make her seem like she's a more formidable opponent, and so they make her into an even larger character than she otherwise would have been.
Thank you, Stacy. We have 3 questions and 6 minutes. So start with the first one, or 4 questions actually. So Stacy, I thoroughly enjoyed, by Paul, again, thoroughly enjoyed your book, and you're fleshing out Cleopatra's character. My question is, what 20th century women impress you? I'm intrigued by Indira Gandhi and all of the obstacles she had to deal with, for example, emergency from colonialism, caste system, religious conflicts, etc. I would enjoy someone fleshing out her character the way you did with Cleopatra. And maybe can we add to the next question? It also talks about, by Erica Johnson's, I'm left feeling a bit melancholy about this lost age when women had so many rights. How do you think about this, especially against the more optimistic take on history that is arc toward justice? So we have 2 questions about modern women.
To take Erica's question first, that was something that tortured me when I was writing the book, because I kept thinking, okay, women enjoyed the right to own their own businesses. They hired flute players, they sued in court, they inherited equally with their brothers, they got, if their husbands left them, they were entitled to a house. I mean, they had every conceivable right, and in some cases more than we have today. And then they lost those rights for 2,000 years. And then every once in a while I would stop myself and think, but wait, that could happen again. So, it's a chilling thought in a way. So I like to remain on the optimistic side of that. If it's any consolation, there were also ideas that were very familiar to Cleopatra that were also lost for not 2,000, but for a good 1,500 or 1,600 years, like the value of pi, where the equator was, the fact that the world was round. So there's an enormous level of sophistication there that goes missing, and that, we have found our way back to. So I just think part of that is just the outlier, which was the Hellenistic world, where you had all of the culture and the accumulated wisdom of the Greeks, at this tail end of an extraordinarily heady world. And just before the rise of Rome, where you have this ferment of ideas in an extraordinarily sophisticated and wealthy society. Why and how it goes missing is is another book altogether. As for 20th century subjects, I'm waiting for someone to send me a new book idea. So I'm very eager to hear about more 20th century women whom we should all admire. I would love to write a book about a 20th century woman. I've never, I for a long time toyed with a medieval woman who essentially sits in a room alone and writes, and which probably tells you something about where my head is. And I couldn't do it for various reasons. And so would be very happy to have a 20th century figure, especially one with a really good archive, especially with a typewritten archive, not a handwritten one, and especially one within 500 miles of my front door.
Yeah, somebody suggesting Angela Merkel, so maybe.
Very German.
So we have a time, yeah.
Go ahead.
So one last question, and I'm gonna combine them together. So were there problems with generations of royal inbreeding? Malcolm Getz is asking, and we have a question from Anonymous. Can you talk more about women's rights in the time of Cleopatra? You mentioned it earlier, so.
The inbreeding, I asked that question of any number of scholars. You'd think if you had, multiple generations of sibling marriage, you would have encountered some problems. There is no recorded instance of any kind of even birth defect that's on the record. However, it's very possible that things didn't make it to the record. It's very possible that some things just were utterly omitted. And as we know, this is a very savage family. This is a very brutal family. And people get knocked off with some regularity. They get chopped into pieces. It's a bloodthirsty dynasty. So any number of things could have happened. And that's also, by the way, an interesting thing with Cleopatra. If she hadn't met her, and thanks to the Romans, she almost certainly would have been at odds with either a sibling or one of her own children. So she would also have met a rather savage end one way or the other. What was the other question? Sorry. Oh, women's rights.
Women's rights, yeah.
I think I sort of touched on this. There was absolute equity in terms of the two sexes in the eyes of the law. And again, that speculatively speaking, that may have been a fallout of the fact that ISIS was so omnipotent at the time. It's an outlier. It was completely a mystifying fact to the Romans. They couldn't understand what that could possibly be about. But it is a society in which a woman could expect a full day in court, where a woman would hire her own band, where she could farm her own fields, where she could operate a business or a mill entirely on her own.
Stacy, it's been a pleasure. I know we have to end here. So shukran. Thank you so much. And we appreciate your taking the time to share your work with the Eqeiq community. And thank you to our audience members for joining us. And I also want to thank Leila Derstein and Kathleen Cohn and the Alum Relations for their support of us here. And I know we have one more question, but I don't think we have time because we have to log off. But I'll post it. There's a question from Jennifer
on my website. So
yeah. So Jennifer Walcott, there's a question of how far back did the equality go? So maybe we can address that in a different time. And just want to remind everyone that there were more meaningful conversation, workshops and program as part of the Society of Alumni that you can participate throughout this year. We hope you'll engage as you're able. And thank you again for joining us. And shukran jazilan in Arabic. And take good care and stay safe.
Thank you, Amal. Thank you, Leila. Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you all for joining us.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.